A couple of young fellows had been attending the boat races, and in the process of walking along the river, they found what they thought was a large stone. One of them picked it up, turned it over, and it had teeth. When I first saw it, I thought we were probably dealing with someone of European descent. So it looked fairly recent. I had him kind of laid out to dry a little bit and was going through cleaning the bones up, and noticed there was a gray object enclosed in the bone of the pelvis, and it was a chipped stone, leaf-shaped spear point. Ran the radiocarbon date. It came back 8410 plus or minus 60 years, and he has physical features of people who are very different physically from modern native peoples.
The Columbia River skeleton turned out to be one of the oldest ever found in the Americas. It got a name,
the first people on this continent were the Indians,
Man.
period. No reason to believe that.
And a reputation.
But this collision of culture, science, and the law could rewrite the history of America.
If the first arrivals on this continent didn't look like today's American Indians, who were they? Chatter's discovery reopened some old wounds.
Dr. Chatters deliberately introduced the idea of Caucasian into the equation, which was then picked up by the press, and very shortly we learned that the Minnesota Vikings were here before any Indian. I have been told by some of Dr. Chatters' colleagues to insist that he measure his own skull, that this will turn out to be Indian, not Caucasian.
First of all, I have never said this was a European once we knew how old the skeleton was. We're talking about the fact that the early people don't look like we expected them to. And the earliest people in the Americas more closely resemble folks of Paleolithic and Mesolithic Japan and peoples of later prehistoric and modern Polynesia. This is not saying these are Europeans. This is not saying white people came here first.
The Umatilla Indians, who live where Kennewick Man was found, have claimed his remains. They want to bury the skeleton.
And this is what truly hurts us as Indian people. When our ancestral remains are considered artifacts, and artifacts that produce data for the benefit of the American people. I'm an American citizen. What about my voice?
Over the objections of a group of prominent archaeologists, the discovery site has been sealed to discourage further excavation. The archaeologists sued to keep the bones available for study. Robson Bonnickson is one of the plaintiffs.
DNA study of the Kennewick skeleton would be a very logical way to understand whether there's any affinity or relationship between that skeleton and modern-day peoples, regardless of where they're at.
Dennis Stanford also sued.
And our technology is getting so good, so fast, and the things we're able to discover and learn just blow me away. Now, what will we know in 10 years? What can we learn in 10 years? But if the resource is gone, we will never know.
They're trying to justify their past, the heinous things that they have done to us in the name of science. Decapitating people, exhuming bodies, lifting heads, measuring skulls, weighing brains, all in the name of science and study.
There are 200,000 sets of Native American remains in American museums. Most of them have lain in drawers untouched since they were first dug up. Responding to decades of Native American protests, Congress passed the the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, NAGPRA, in 1990. Museums, colleges, and federal agencies now have to offer human remains back to the tribes.
Our relatives, we are now here. We have come for you. We are taking you back home.
Many Native Americans believe that the spirit does not wholly abandon the body after death. The lingering spirit can harm or be harmed by the living. And its presence in the ground ties a people to that place. The story of the bones' return throws a new, somewhat startling light on American history. The question first arose over 300 years ago when the Pilgrims found some Indian graves. In November 1620, the Pilgrims dropped anchor inside Cape Cod and went ashore to look for a town site. As an early chronicle tells it,
when they had marched about the space of a mile by the sea, they espied 5 or 6 people with a dog coming towards them, who were savages, who when they saw them ran into the wood and whistled the dog after them.
Other English vessels had come here and on many occasions had actually taken our people off the beaches, and we never saw them again. So it wasn't our custom to go up and greet the English anymore.
They soon found fields with corn stubble and a number of curious small mounds. They dug into one.
We found a bow, and as we thought, arrows, but they were rotten. We supposed there were many other things, but because we deemed them graves, we put in the bow again and made it up as it was, because we thought it would be odious unto them to ransack their sepulchres.
What they didn't know is that a decade or so before they came, there was an extremely virulent pandemic up and down that portion of the New England coast, from probably somewhere in the Plymouth area up towards Saco, Maine, the area of what were known as the Massachusetts speakers, more than 90% mortality.
They came upon 2 abandoned villages where they found stores of buried food.
We digged further and found a fine great new basket full of very fair corn. We took all the ears and put a good deal of the loose corn in the kettle for 2 men to bring away on a staff.
Here were all these areas of cleared but fallow fields, pathways, village sites, no people. Here is this land made ready for you. Well, what's the obvious conclusion you're going to draw? Thank you, Lord. You have provided your faithful servants with what you promised.
A grave mound of unusual size appeared.
We mused what it should be and resolved to dig it up. We found bowls, trays, dishes, and such like trinkets. We brought sundry of the prettiest things away with us and covered the corpse up again.
The Mayflower was here on the Cape for 5 weeks. And it's easy to read too much into, a moment like that. But in some ways, an awful lot of the next 200-300 years of history was being acted out here on the Cape in those first 5 weeks.
Our ancestors are beneath us, still making medicine for us. And when they're disturbed, then our medicine is also disturbed, you see. I often wondered if the English were aware of that, and that was part of their conquest.
More than 100 years later, Thomas Jefferson, not yet the 3rd President of the United States, became the founding father of American archaeology. He systematically excavated an Indian burial mound near his childhood home in Virginia.
made a cut through it to observe what was inside of it. He found numerous remains scattered in what he thought was a haphazard fashion, which was the custom of the Monicans, to bury the bones all in one kind of a heap.
The bones nearest the surface were least decayed. No holes were discovered in any of them, as if made with bullets, arrows, or other weapons. I conjectured that in this barrow might have been 1,000 skeletons. Thomas Jefferson.
It's really scary and really painful, to understand that your people are just sort of curiosities.
It's not unlike Native Americans going to Rome, let's say, or to Ireland or to Germany, and excavating burials in the interest of science, their science.
Jefferson knew that local Indians built the mound he excavated, but further west from Mississippi up to Minnesota were mounds so imposing that scholars of the time sought another explanation. They usually gave credit to past visitors, the Welsh, the lost tribes of Israel, or the Phoenicians. Samuel G. Morton, a Philadelphia doctor, set out to solve the puzzle. He compared skulls dug out of the mounds with those of modern Indians. Their dimensions proved to be similar.
There was a theory basically created by Morton, who's supposed to be the father of physical anthropology, that if you measure a skull, you can figure out cranial capacity, brain cavity capacity, and the larger the brain, the more civilized the creature.
Morton thought whites have the biggest heads and Africans the smallest, with Indians somewhere in between. To confirm this, his successors went out looking for more skulls.
The benevolent mind may regret the inaptitude of the Indian for civilization. The structure of his mind appears to be different from that of the white man. Samuel G. Morton.
Literally for centuries, or for a couple of centuries, native graves in North America have been dealt with as a source of information on who the European invaders and settlers are. I mean, if you go all the way to the beginning, first they're looking for evidence of a high civilization here that would link America to the classical world. Then they started looking at them as evidence for evolution that culminates in, of course, the Europeans.
The idea came that you could determine race simply by the morphology, which is the bone structure of a creature. So there were horrendous things that went on the battlefield. They'd cut off the skulls of dead Indians and ship them to the Smithsonian. They robbed graves at night.
The Pawnee stayed in the Nebraska, northern Kansas area and tended to settle around the Loup River and to hunt down in the Kansas area around the Republican River and the Smoky Hill Great Buffalo Grounds. And they're unusual in most people's minds because they're agriculturalists and they lived in the villages. The Pawnee find themselves being devastated by the Sioux, and at the same time they're being devastated by terrible epidemic diseases like the smallpox. And so they had to find some way to survive.
In 1869, whites who had settled in the Pawnee's Kansas hunting grounds appealed to the Army for protection against Sioux and Cheyenne raids. Troops were sent from Fort Harker to teach the Indians a lesson. The Pawnee were a friendly tribe. Ignoring the Army's warnings, Pawnee foraging parties headed south toward Kansas.
The Pawnees were fighting the Sioux, the Cheyenne, the Arapahoes, and often combinations of those groups at one time. So the chiefs decided to ally themselves with the United States government And in doing so, many Pawnee men served in special units called Pawnee Scouts. They served as trackers, they served as fighters, they served as guards for the railroad. So we have a long history of being allied with the United States and our men going off to fight the wars of the United States.
On January 29, 1869, a dozen or so Pawnee men stopped at Charles Martin's house asking for food. Martin's neighbors ran to protect him, and the Pawnee fled down Mulberry Creek.
Some of them went south across the stream to a high bluff. As we stood looking, 4 Indians raised up side by side. They had discharges from the army, and one of them handed his discharge to the whites. It was passed from one to another. While this was going on, Alverson, who was in our group, slipped off his horse and shot the Indian leader dead. The Indians began firing, and the troops soon appeared on the scene. Richard Clark.
By day's end, 6 Pawnee were dead. But the story was not over.
In 1868, the U.S. Surgeon General, in fact, literally issued an order directing Army medical personnel to procure crania of Native Americans and for use in the Army Medical Museum back in Washington, D.C.
I had already obtained for the museum the skull of one of the Pawnees, and would have had all had it not been that immediately after the engagement the Indians lurked about their dead and watched them so closely that the guide I sent out was unable to secure but the one. Until within a day or two, the snow has prevented a further attempt. Yesterday I sent a scout who knows the spot. It may be that I can, after a time, obtain all. B. E. Fryer, Post Surgeon, Fort Harker, Kansas.
2 months later, Fryer shipped 26 heads to Washington, including all 6 of the Pawnee dead. The Pawnee chiefs demanded justice from the Army, explaining that the victims had been veterans. The Army couldn't locate any record of the killings.
Until we achieved the repatriation laws of 1989 and 1990, we were the archaeological resources of the United States of America.
There are those kinds of things throughout history in all cultures. But we can't change them simply by apologizing now. They will always be there, and some generation in the future will come back and want an apology again for those events because they're still there. They're still part of history.
In 1890, the Hopi in present-day Arizona were one of the few tribes living traditionally in their original homeland. They resisted federal policies aimed at bringing them into the civilized world.
The Indian agent began to think about agenda to really impress especially the Hopi leaders, chiefs of the Hopis that had never been away from the reservation. So sponsor a trip under the guise of meeting the Great White Father. And they went to Gallup and got on the Santa Fe Railroad. And along the way, they stopped at Fort Leavenworth. They visited this huge penitentiary. They never realized that this was another part of the white man's way of life, to put people in jail. And when Hopis began to look at the Kansas farms, they were just in awe. Kansas City, St. Louis, already 1 million people there. And yes, they did finally arrive in Washington, D.C. and finally had a chance to meet with the president. But they didn't stop there. They were given a grand tour of the Naval Academy at Annapolis, and then over to an army base somewhere where thousands of soldiers marched before them carrying rifles. And they were told that tribes that resisted were wiped out. And they came back to the Hopi villages in total shock.
Once the Hopi and other Indians were subdued, America's attitude changed.
By the end of the 19th century, Native people were literally decimated. I mean, by European diseases, by social Darwinism that, wanted to hold out that Native and indigenous people weren't fully developed as rational human beings. A government policy built on that premise. Really, in a way, they're human beings, but the federal government has to offer sort of a parental oversight because they really are incapable of making judgments.
See, very kind-hearted people looked out and they saw Indians just being slaughtered. And they decided, well, in 2 generations, no one will even know these people were here, so we better preserve whatever knowledge we have of them.
So now there was this syndrome called the Vanishing Indian syndrome that was sort of a phenomenon during the late 1880s that again prompted, for example, the Smithsonian, the Peabody Museum in Harvard, the Chicago Film Museum, the Natural History Museum in New York, to sponsor formal expeditions to all tribal groups.
The Bureau of Ethnology, now part of the Smithsonian Institution, dispatched anthropologist Frank Cushing to the Southwest to work with the Zuni and Hopi tribes.
Cushing thought, what better way to get what I want, which is, some of these cultural material, than to come in and offer trade goods. In the late 1800s, the Hopi lands had undergone several seasons of very dry weather, and corn supplies were slowly dwindling. Cattle were slowly dying off because the rangelands were in poor shape. It was an easy choice for many families who were faced with that. They traded for food.
In many ways, we still operate under, in the United States at least, in popular consciousness, that image that somehow the Indians are all gone. The buffaloes are gone. We don't see the painted ponies.
Natural history museums were helping Americans to visualize eras in the past when creatures were large, scary, and exotic. Then a new discovery put Native Americans into that picture.
If you and I were talking about this 50 years ago, the discussion would be about whether humans had been in the Americas for 2,000 years or 3,000 years. And then Jesse Figgins of this museum came along in the mid-1920s, excavated the Folsom site in New Mexico, and pushed the human timeline back to the end of the Ice Age, about 10,000 years ago. He demonstrated the presence of human tools amongst these bones of extinct bison. That really captured a part of the American imagination, the idea that humans lived here at the same time as mammoth and mastodon, saber-toothed cats. So people found that if they went out and looked in the same kinds of arroyos, gee, what a surprise. Sometimes they found similar bones.
I had been on a dig down on Blaylock Island on the Columbia River before they built the John Day Dam. Skeletal material had been revealed in some of those sites, and I had visited with some of my Umatilla friends that I used to rodeo with in high school and college. And they asked me, they said, "Well, Durd, did you dig up my grandmother today or my grandfather?" And I said, I was unaware that we were digging up your grandfather or grandmother. They said, "Well, we think maybe you are." And from that time forward, I began to wonder about what we were doing. It was like we were there as if the Indians weren't there.
Of course, Native American people did not disappear. Their population was somewhere around 210,000 in 1910 and is up to over a couple of million today. And we have also today a tremendous resurgence in ways of thinking and in systems of value that are very, very richly rooted in a deep past.
In the early 70s, inspired by the civil rights and anti-war movements, Native Americans spoke up.
Indian, but this proposal of the government's provides for a park which will have some supervision by hand-picked Indians subject to the government.
The Red Power movement, the American Indian movement, much of those political movements was about really a reconnecting to who we were as Native people spiritually. So it sort of makes sense that we would end up having to take care of this, desecration that had occurred.
It became apparent to me that even Boy Scout troops were going out and digging up Indian graves. They were spending an awful lot of time enjoying themselves on Sunday afternoons desecrating Indian ancestors. And in total innocence, not realizing what they were doing. But there were others who were digging them up for the money, for the collection.
I became aware of the Indian burial pit probably in the late 70s. And that was just from driving down I-70 and seeing this sign. Many people have asked, why didn't Native people make an issue of this site earlier? For many of us, the whole notion somehow that one would visit a desecrated burial site is something that is repulsive, and to many of us we would view as very harmful to our own spiritual and physical well-being.
The Indian burial pit was in Salina, Kansas, a few miles from the scene of the Mulberry Creek massacre. It belonged to the Price family, who ran it as a roadside attraction. In the early 1980s, the state of Kansas developed a plan to turn the exhibit into an up-to-date museum.
With us today is a gentleman who has a great deal of knowledge about that particular burial pit, representing the state of Kansas, Mr. Tom Whitty, who is a state archaeologist.
Haskell Indian Nations University convened interested parties to discuss the state's plans.
I've been involved with Kansas archaeology for about 25 years, almost all of that time directly related to recognizing and interpreting the Indian cultures of Kansas. So I have a strong identity and involvement with your culture and with your people.
I just wonder, if one of our tribe people would find bones of a non-Indian and put them out on display and ask for admission. I wonder what they would do to us.
Our first priority should be, and hopefully it will be, to close this place down immediately.
If you understand that the roots of many of those organizations, the activists involved, had to do in sort of a reconnecting to our own spiritual and religious traditions, then I think it makes perfect sense that this was going to be an issue that was going to be placed really prominently on the agenda.
But yet we have teachers all across this land. And if you do not study what they are teaching, you are going to flunk that test. Because it is their interpretation of the Indian lifestyles.
Let's bury the people. Let's bury them. We don't want them on display anymore. I think they've been on display for 50 years, and I think that is enough. If the archaeologists cannot find something within that 50 years, then they never will.
These people lived in those smoky hills for hundreds, thousands of years before you arrived. What right do you have to dig up those burials, to make commercial profit, to exploit those peoples?
There's legislation pending right now in the state of Wisconsin on the subject as well. So it's not only Kansas that is coming to grips with this issue.
The Haskell Symposium changed Tom Whitty's plans. The state of Kansas bought the burial pit in order to close it down.
This property was acquired
by a more or less a contract or an agreement prepared by Walter Echo called the Smoky Hill Treaty. The signees would be the Price family that owned the property. This was when the state was to buy it. The county and the State Historical Society, all right? And set forth in that agreement was that there was to be 30 days set aside for study of the remains, okay? We did this study in 30 days, 4 of us working in there every day. And then the burial pit was to be filled in with sand. And then once that was up to the top of the wall, a 6-inch concrete slab was put over it. I realized later, and not too shortly after that, that this had to be, because if they would have been nice and polite, I wouldn't have accepted it. In other words, it's like the old joke, how do you get the mule's attention? You hit him across the forehead with a 2x4.
It really startles people when we step out of this sort of invisible status we have to say, we're here.
The Pawnee tribe, now living in Oklahoma, knew that their old villages in Nebraska had been excavated by archaeologists. They sent attorney Walter Echohawk of the Native American Rights Fund to investigate.
Our tribal cemeteries were in fact dug up and plundered by early settlers in Nebraska almost as soon as the tribe was removed from Nebraska by the government in the 1870s. And then in the 1920s, the archaeologists under people like Asa Hill went in and dug up entire cemeteries of Pawnee people.
Hill became what many would regard as the father of archaeology in Nebraska. He found a farm that he thought was rich in Indian remains, and he bought the farm. He literally bought the farm so that he'd be able to excavate Pawnee graves. It suggests a kind of value system that transcends Indian interest. And when you talk about conquest archaeology, you're talking about an archaeology that it really in many ways isn't responsible to American Indians. It's responsible to itself and to science.
We're having lots of luck in finding skeletons. Have lots of visitors. A.T. Hill.
He became such close friends with the Pawnees and discussed with them what he was doing. They were completely in agreement with what he was doing. And this is back in the 1920s and 30s. And he was adopted by them. And the letters from the Pawnees to A.T. Hill, which are still in the Nebraska State Historical Society, are always addressed to Dear Brother Hill.
I don't play golf. My only recreation is this Indian investigation. I come out here Sundays and dig up Indians. This hill is my golf course. A.T. Hill.
You know, prehistoric people left us no record other than their bones and the artifacts that they abandoned or lost. And so, if we want to know anything about these people, this is the book.
There was no legal authority to do this. There was, in fact, some deception involved about this, and very, very, very troubling to see scientists act in a fashion of that nature.
At the end of his career, Hill sold his collection to the Nebraska State Historical Society for the token sum of $1.
The entire Pawnee tribe was very, very upset and deeply concerned to discover that the Historical Society had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of our dead relatives. The Historical Society had the position at that time that these were property that belonged to the Historical Society, and that if they were to be returned to the Pawnee tribe, that this would result in the loss of scientific information.
The philosophical problem that confronted me as an administrator of an organization that operated museums was, do you bow to public pressure or group pressure brought on you to change your museum collections, to alter them, to destroy basically a scientific collection that had taken 75 years to build?
The Native American Rights Fund hired historian Orland Svingen to find out what the society had.
I talked with Director Hansen, and shortly thereafter, it became very evident that I wasn't going to have access to the kinds of records I would need, to answer the questions that the Native American Rights Fund had put to me.
The human remains and associated artifacts that we have were acquired with the knowledge and consent of the Nebraska Attorney General, and were acquired by the legal and ethical standards of the time.
The Historical Society engaged in a very, very hostile and insensitive opposition to any return of any of these remains. Along the way, it entailed 4 or 5 Attorney General opinions, a lawsuit, extensive negotiations and hearings before the Historical Society, and ultimately a passage of a state law that mandated this actual repatriation.
Now they get to dictate to the scientists what the scientists will study, how long they can look at the material, if at all, and whether or not it is of any future value, because they get to decide whether or not it's reburied.
In 1987, pot hunters, who had paid a local farmer for permission, opened more than 650 ancient graves with a backhoe at Slack Farms in Kentucky. The story became national news and strengthened the growing pressure for laws to protect Indian burials.
A lot of people who got attracted to the pot hunting and the arrowhead collecting and grave robbing, they could not even fathom that there were living descendants of those people whose graves they were desecrating.
In 1927, Dr. Don F. Dixon, an Illinois chiropractor, turned a burial mound on the family farm into a roadside exhibit.
In grade school, we went pretty often to Dixon Mounds, and this was my first introduction to Indian culture. Dr. Dixon got down in with the graves, and he talked about the culture, and as a child made me wonder what was it like then for the Indians. It gave me a respect for them. He brought out a sensitivity in us toward the American Indian. This is our view of the American Indian. A strong person, a person that lived with the land, and we can identify with that person.
The Dixon family died, and they sold the state the property, and then it was developed by the state into a modern museum facility.
The new building perches atop the burial site. Archaeologist Alan Harn became Dr. Dixon's successor.
But if you look closely at 106, at the clavicle has just been completely crushed on the right side. There is some fracturing here.
We are so isolated here in central Illinois that the average Illinois citizen has never seen a real Indian. His only contact with Indian people or with Indian culture comes through a visit to a museum like Dixon Mound.
They should learn that they could learn more by talking to live Indians than they ever could by questioning or studying dead ones.
People, to a certain extent, feel that they're acting reverent. They look upon these remains and they're hushed tones, and they think that there's some type of a sanctity, and they must view this, but they have to view it very quietly and with a lot of respect. and then they leave and they walk over to the snack shop, they buy a hot dog, and then go outside on circus day and get a balloon from the clown.
Native American activists decided to take a stand at Dixon Mounds.
It became a very acrimonious debate at that time. It wasn't even a debate. It was a number of Indian representatives making clear their point of view, and local people very diametrically opposed views.
This is a sacred site. Anyone that interferes with us will be prosecuted. That includes any state, local, and county official. We had several demonstrations, several rallies. It took us about a year and a half. Finally, we jumped down into the burial pit and physically used shovels and covered up many of the bodies. Because I said, arrest us. If it's a law that prevents us from burying our dead, it needs to be challenged. We've tried to work with these people. We've pleaded with them. We've talked to them. We've gone to their congressmen. Sometimes it's important to do what's right, not necessarily what's legal.
I've been a great admirer of the American Indian from the time I was big enough to read. Through my professional years, I was a champion and a supporter of the Indians and of Indian people in general. And I was really taken aback when all of a sudden I learned that I was a part of something that was very bad.
As far as people coming in now and saying, well, this was wrong, we didn't think about it being wrong.
Late in '89, the Illinois State Museum, of which we're a part, decided to recommend closure of the Dixon burial exhibit to public view. There was a tremendous amount of consternation on the part of local people, local politicians, that they had not been forewarned of this. They had never realized it was a problem. It came as a great shock to them.
The sad thing is that this is a place where many young children first confront their own mortality. They realize that someday they're going to die, but more importantly, they realize that these Indians that they see before them were actually people.
They're going to miss an awful lot. I mean, the children really are going to miss an awful lot. And I'm sorry that it had to happen.
Is there some good that comes out of this?
I don't know. I don't think so. I don't think so. Because we got so many people now that say, I have a right for this and a right for that. You know.
A lot of the problems that exist today in urban Indian communities are a direct result of not having an identity, of not having anything to cling to. By restoring a little bit of this dignity and respect to our ancestors gives us a place, and therefore gives us a base to combat some of these problems.
What we are dealing with is a small group of people from Oklahoma that are over here trying to advance their cause at our expense.
It's something, once it's closed, it kind of goes away. And this is something that's our heritage or our past that's happened here.
Despite the local people's resistance, the burial room at Dixon Mounds finally closed its doors.
It's the woman that calls us up and challenges to come out here, and said, have all you men lost your warrior blood? We're going to ask these four ladies to take some sacred tobacco ties and symbolically put them on the doors.
Our culture and our heritage has been taken over by scientific people and historians who feel that they're in a better position to relate our history. Indians are not only people of the past, but they're people of the present and people of the future.
In 1990, what was happening in the States became national policy. Congress passed the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act.
We created a electronic database to load the records individually.
NAGPRA requires any federally funded institution, government agency, college, or museum to give Indian tribes an inventory of the human remains, grave goods, and ritual objects in its collections. Each tribe then has the right to reclaim its own.
10 records that are about Corn Hill. And this one is about the human remains.
As Indian people, we entered into numerous treaties with the United States, but at no time did we ever cede our dead. We ceded some of our land. We got things in return from the federal government, but we maintained our right to own our dead.
These are human right laws, and they're civil right laws as well.
It really is the culmination of the Indian activism that began in the late 60s, challenging young American Indian men and women to get involved and to play a role in their own nation's self-determination. We're the first generation to get college educations. It's given Native people the expertise, the know-how to tackle these issues in the forums and the institutions that are the dominant societies.
Professor James Riding-In tracked down the Mulberry Creek Massacre victims in Washington, D.C. On behalf of the Pawnee tribe, he asked the Smithsonian Institution to give them back.
American people, by and large, are very concerned about the fate of our dead. For example, the American people have made a commitment to get back all the remains of the U.S. servicemen that were killed in Vietnam. And as a Vietnam veteran myself, I can relate to that very well. We need to get those remains back for proper reburial.
The Smithsonian agreed to return its collection of Pawnee remains, including the 6 who died at Mulberry Creek. Attorney Walter Echohawk and Elizabeth Black Owl, president of the Pawnee Tribal Council, went to the Smithsonian to get them back.
1867, and then they were transferred here in 1904.
It was a very somber, sort of a bittersweet day to go through these repatriation processes and reburials.
These were combined for the same reason as these.
It was certainly a victory because of the long period of time it took and the passage of laws and litigation and all sorts of appeals and that sort of thing that made this possible. But it was sad, all right, at the same time, you know, as far as these dead relatives that had been never laid to rest in a proper way. And so it was something that I will never forget in my lifetime.
The Pawnee Scouts, along with other remains from federal agencies and the Nebraska State Historical Society, were buried in a cemetery near Genoa, Nebraska. Many of the dead had been excavated from a nearby Pawnee burial site.
I'm real proud, you know, of my elders here, that tribal leaders, you know, that have worked, you know, hard to make this happen. I guess you could say the hard way.
The most important thing that happened was that the Pawnee did it, that this is a real case of democracy in action, that these people had control of some part of their own lives. They struggled to get that control. They saw it through. They're a good example of what ought to happen in our culture where there's diversity, but there's also democracy.
For some reason, the soldiers and settlers opened fire on these people, and they even did so, according to one of the eyewitness accounts we had, when they were showing their discharge papers to the soldiers and settlers.
When we do put those ancestors back into Mother Earth, it brings us great joy. We know that they're back with the Creator, where the Creator had intended them to be.
8.
There's satisfaction in being able to do this. There's satisfaction in breaking down some of those practices that have ignored our rights as human beings. And we have to fight these struggles. These struggles are still going on. We are still fighting to get our ancestors' remains back. And we will continue this struggle for many years. We're not going to give up.
He's called Kennewick Man, claimed by Indian tribes as a direct ancestor.
In 1996, a year after the Pawnee Scouts' reburial, the repatriation debate flared up again, hotter than ever.
He's not related at all to modern tribes.
To take known individuals and boil them down and put their bones in the museum for study was, in effect, a heinous act. It was an immoral act. And it's not something we would consider appropriate now. And so it is appropriate to take those remains and return them to family members. But to take that and extend it to all time.
We don't know the story of how the Americas were initially peopled. And for many years, people thought there was a single human migration about 11,500 years ago. That early model envisioned people walked across the Bering Land Bridge. Now, some of the recent genetic and archaeological evidence and linguistic evidence suggests that it's probable that human beings moved along the Pacific Rim, probably using small boats, maybe sometime between 20 and 30,000 years ago.
Kennewick Man's face resembles that of Ainu people, you know, the Aboriginal people in Japan. It resembles them. What that may be telling us, and we won't know without multiple additional people to tell us, but what that may be telling us is that there was an early migration around the Pacific Rim that preceded the North Asian or Mongoloid invasion that came later.
You know, the amount of material that's required for these destructive tests is minuscule. And I think that some destructive tests are fairly critical. Without doing the DNA testing, you don't know how these remains might be genetically related to other human populations locally or worldwide.
They always tell us that the information yield from studies would tell us our history. We already know our history. It may not be written down, but we already know our history.
At some point in the future, maybe not this generation or even the next, but eventually, people are going to want to know. And it might be too late.
What our older people have told us is that once a body goes back to the ground, that's where it's to remain until the end of time.
He's become many things to many different people, but who he was an old man who'd been beaten up a great deal and endured a whole lot. A long time ago. The political activists in the Indian community want to grab him and take him and put him away as a manifestation of their power to do so. He's a spokesman for his people. Come forward to let us know what his time and his people were like.
Leave it alone. Leave it alone and treat it as if it was your own family